Hello, everyone. I'm Bob Goulder, a contributing editor with Tax Notes. Welcome to the latest installment of In the Pages, where we take a closer look at some of the more thought-provoking articles that have appeared in our publications recently. Today's topic could not be more timely. We're talking about the Biden administration's big economic plan, and you can't miss it. It's literally all over the news. President Biden wants about $1.9 trillion in pandemic-related relief, and he would like it sooner rather than later. But some lawmakers in Congress are saying not so fast. That's a lot of money to spend. Do we really need to go that big? What if something smaller could be more targeted? Lots of great arguments on both sides. But, you know, for our purposes, we're not going to fixate on the actual amount of the stimulus, because that's a political process and it will work its way out. We're sort of, we have bigger fish to fry. We're thinking about the big picture here, about how the various pieces of the Biden's plan fit together. Now, somebody who has been thinking a lot about these issues is Tax Notes chief economist, Marty Sullivan. He recently wrote an article that summarizes all of his thoughts on these matters, and it appeared in the February 1st edition of Tax Notes, and it's titled, "Leave the Tax Hikes, Take the Infrastructure," which, if you don't know, is a cinematic reference to The Godfather, leave the guns, take the cannolis. But cinematic references aside, let me introduce my good friend and my favorite economist, Marty Sullivan. Welcome back to the program.
Bob, thank you for having me on your program. It's an honor to be here. And you're right, this is a pretty timely topic. Where should we begin?
Let's begin with this idea that the Biden plan. One thing that's very clear is the White House, they don't worry about being labeled that they're trying to do too much, or they're being too assertive, or they're moving too fast. They view all of those things as positive attributes. So they're fine with those characterizations. But before we launch into the macroeconomics, can you give us, give our listeners a little better description of what is actually in the plan?
Yeah, well, I think it's a two-part plan, and it kind of makes sense. The rescue plan, as you said, is a $1.9 trillion expenditure of expenditures and tax cuts that would not be paid for. They would be deficit spending. And in traditional macroeconomics, when you have deficit spending, that stimulates the economy. And then the second part of his plan is called the recovery plan. And in broad brushstrokes, what it is a lot of infrastructure. And this part has not been fleshed out yet. He said he was going to announce it on the State of the Union address. But the rescue plan would be a lot of infrastructure, trillions of dollars of infrastructure, paid for by tax cuts on corporations and high-income individuals, where high income is defined as over $400,000. The most notable corporate tax increase would be the increase in the corporate rate from 21 to 28%. And the most notable international tax increase would be a strengthening of the GILTI, which is the minimum tax on foreign income of US corporations. Then on the individual side, the tax hikes which are proposed are an increase in the individual rate. But I think the biggest thing is the increase in the capital gains tax rate, combined with, even bigger than that, the end of step up in basis at death, which is the major way that super wealthy people are able to avoid taxes. So just stepping back again, part one, stimulus not paid for. Part two, recovery infrastructure paid for with tax cuts on the wealthy.
Okay, just a few words about the scope.
Mm-hmm.
What's the downside of going big? Is there a problem if we go too big?
Well, right now, there's a big debate. Hardly anybody's talking about the second part. So I think we're going to focus on the first part, which is the 1.9 trillion. And what you hear things are like, we need to go big, or it's better to go big than small. which isn't really a good policy guide when you're spending $1.9 trillion. We need to be a little more specific about that. Before I get into that, let me just mention a couple of other things that really animate the debate, but maybe not fall under the heading of stimulus per se. On the one side, you have people who want to provide whatever is necessary to get people through this pandemic. So pandemic relief. So whatever it costs, we need X trillion dollars to kill the pandemic. We're just going to do that. That's one way of looking at this. Another way of looking at this is, hey, there's a big disparity in the distribution of wealth in this country. And while we Democrats have the opportunity to do it, we're going to do it. And that's not necessary. Of course, the pandemic has increased the disparity between rich and poor, but we're going to take care of more of this long-term problem. So notice that those two are related to stimulus, but could be independent of stimulus. On the other side, you have conservatives and Republicans, and a lot of people not in those categories who are concerned about the incredible increase in the debt that we've had in the last decade. The debt to GDP ratio doubled in the last recession from 35 to 70%. And in this current recession, it's jumped from 80 to 100%. So, if you told me about this 20 years ago, I think I would have had a heart attack thinking we'd ever have a debt that high. So that's sort of the backdrop. Now, let's talk about stimulus. Like, let's just say we want it right now. We're about 9 million jobs short of where we were in February 1 year ago. And how are we going to get those back? Now, right now, two very prominent economists, Olivier Blanchard, former chief economist at the IMF, and Larry Summers, former almost everything, head of the NEC, Treasury, Harvard University president, very prominent economists who have been big advocates of increasing aggressive fiscal policy, are now saying, well, you know what, maybe that 1.9 trillion is too big. And so to have them say it is sort of very sobering, because you go, well, if they who are normally in favor of large deficits are saying this deficit is too big, that gives you some pause. So the administration disagrees with that. Right before this phone call, I was doing some research to me, which suggests they could be a little too conservative. But in any case, there is disagreement about how large the stimulus should be. Again, I think most people are not thinking about it the way we economists are thinking about it, but they're thinking about it in terms of, we want to get these social programs in, or we want to keep the deficit down.
No, the next question is about timing.
Yes,
Biden's
sir.
got a plan, and there's two parts: stimulus or rescue, and then recovery. And you've mentioned how they seem to be sort of directionally opposed, where one is expansionary and the other one maybe is anti-expansionary. How do you know when to turn the dial back on the stimulus? If you were going to have these tax hikes, when would you do them? Because basic Keynesian economics, you don't want to raise taxes while the economy's soft, because you've got problems with aggregate demand. You want to bolster it, and taxing people more just takes more of their disposable income away from them. How do you know when it's safe to dial back the stimulus?
There's a very strong argument for as soon as possible. So this is the front end for turning it on. I know you asked about turning it off, but we're going to turn it on, and we want to do that as soon as possible, because economists are starting to realize that I'm going to use a big word here, hysteresis. You ever hear of that?
Nope.
Most people have never heard of it. And all it is a big word that means the longer you keep an economy in recession, it's not like you can just reverse that, with a change in aggregate demand. because there are long-term effects. And the most notable one is a loss of job skills. So, hey, I've been out of work for 3 years. Guess what? I'm much less hireable, much less desirable to be a worker. So that's one reason to do it as soon as possible. And Biden is doing it as soon as possible. That he keeps saying that. Now, when to turn it off? It's too bad. It's the classic examples are when inflation rates and interest rates are too high. Inflation expectations for the next 10 years are less than 2%. So we are concerned about overheating the economy. That's the word you'll hear. But even if we went to, God forbid, 4% inflation, I really don't see that as being some terrible tragedy. So, what is the tremendous downside of having an overheated economy? Too many jobs? Well, I don't think that's a problem, but that's not what people are talking about. You might be worried about interest rates going up and have an offsetting effect, causing bankruptcies, inflation going up and driving everybody crazy, or the Fed overreacting to those higher interest rates and slamming on the monetary brakes to make up for that. But there's really, again, you want to look at the inflation rate and the interest rate and say, if they start rising too much, in excess of 2%, some people say, I think you can go a lot higher than that, you should turn on the brakes.
I wanted to ask you a question about a quoted passage here. You put pen to paper and put this in writing, so I wanted to toss it back to you and get a response here. You said, the first thing we need to remind ourselves of is that addressing income equality and raising overall taxes aren't necessarily the same thing. The reason I mention this is because the second part of the Biden plan does envision some tax hikes. So people are saying, well, you just roll back the bits of TCJA that you don't like. Politically, is the goal to actually solve income inequality, or is the goal to just satisfy this visceral political response to say, we don't like the Trump era tax cuts, we want to scale it back? Because it's very reminiscent of what Republicans did with Obamacare. When they came to power, they know there's this thing called the ACA, and they're not really sure how they want to dismantle it. They just know it polls well, that when they can go in front of their constituents and say, yes, I scaled back the ACA. Is this kind of the flip side of that?
Well, as Joe Thorndike will tell you, if you look at the opinion polls for as long back as they go, raising taxes on corporations is extremely popular across the board. And one thing you heard Janet Yellen say during her confirmation hearing, I don't think we're going to raise anybody's taxes as long as this pandemic is here. All right, but let's just put that aside for a second. Let's say it's next year. Let's say the economy is doing well. Our vaccinations are all working well. And so, Mr. Biden goes, okay, I want to do my recovery plan now. So we're going to build all this infrastructure and raise taxes. Now, what should we do? One argument I would make is you don't have to pay for it because you're building infrastructure, which is capital and investment. So that's one way of looking at it. Okay? And I feel very strong. It's not like theory or anything. It's accounting, arithmetic. But then you have people going, well, I don't like the fact that all these corporations are not paying their fair share. That's an opinion. You may have that opinion. You may not have that opinion. Everybody has their own opinion about that, and that's politics and that's tax policy. But if you feel that way, why not raise taxes on the wealthy and reduce them on lowering, instead of just raising them on the wealthy? Why don't you raise the taxes on the wealthy and reduce them on low income folks? So that you create, first of all, that creates even more stimulus because you're putting more spending power into the lower end of the income distribution. And also you're making the system even more progressive than Biden is proposing. So it just occurred to me that you don't have to have tax increases for a variety of reasons. One is, again, the capital, taking into account the capital spending. The other is the economy may not be strong enough yet. And then if you do raise taxes, there are a lot of different ways of doing it.
I had one more question for you. And do we need to worry about the ghost of Allan Hansen coming back to haunt us? Because one of the more interesting pieces of your article, where you gave a little narrative saying that there was this American economist back in the 1930s who basically warned of an economic scenario, and because the conditions weren't applying then, people just forgot about his theories. But now his ideas are, dare I say, starting to come back into vogue.
Yeah.
If the ghost of Allan Hansen were to come back to haunt us, what would that look like?
Well, first, let me say, Allan Hansen just wasn't an economist, because I'm sure you could always find an economist who say anything. He was the president of the American Economic Association, so he wasn't exactly a fringe, character. You always can find these fringe folks, or spouting different economic theories. So he was a very well respected economist. And let me play with your head a little bit. You have supply and you have demand.
Oh, yeah.
And when you cross those lines, you got an equilibrium price. Remember that? Well, it turns out that there's nothing in theory that says for savings, the supply of loanable funds and the demand for loanable funds, that equilibrium has to be a positive number. So what he was saying was the equilibrium savings rate, interest rate might have to be negative. Now, there's a problem with that, which is you really can't have negative interest rate. I mean, you can have slightly negative interest rates, as we're seeing in Europe. That means Federal Reserve policy, the way Federal Reserve policy works is they increase the money supply, that reduces interest rates, and that stimulates demand. Well, if you're already at what they call the ZLB, zero lower bound, the Fed can't do it. And so what has to happen to offset the increase in supply of savings, which is driving down the interest rate, is you have to stimulate aggregate demand. It's the only way out of what Keynes would have called the liquidity trap. All I ask folks to think about is two things. Again, why are interest rates so tremendously low? If you can't answer that, then, and not anybody can conclusively, then you really can't walk around and say it's never going to happen. And the other thing I say is, Japan is a case study in secular stagnation. Their debt to GDP ratio is over 200%. Their inflation is negative. Their GDP growth in real terms is negative. Their population growth is negative. They're not dying or anything. It's a little exaggerating, but they're not suffering. They're still the world's third largest economy and enjoy a very high standard of living, but they're not growing. So nobody knows for sure. I certainly don't. But I used to be a deficit hawk. You can go back and read my articles, yakking and moaning and groaning about the deficits. But I've changed my views in a light of new facts, I hope. So I've never been wrong before, so it's a new thing for me. No, just kidding.
We know you won't be wrong. Marty, always a pleasure talking to you. We will continue to monitor this story. Obviously, it's going to be in the headlines, what happens with Congress and the stimulus. So we'll be able to track this.
It's the central question right now.
Yeah. If they want to find this piece in the Tax Notes archive, it's called Leave the Tax Hikes, Take the Infrastructure by Martin A. Sullivan. And that was in the February 1st edition of Tax Notes. Until next time, Marty, thank you for joining us, and we'll see what happens.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Yep. Bye-bye.